companies, and is brought to you today by your cable or satellite provider. After withdrawing from the 2016 Republican presidential race earlier this year, Kentucky's junior Senator Rand Paul focused on winning re-election. The first-term senator faces Democratic challenger Jim Gray, the mayor of Lexington, and tonight the two debate. From Kentucky Education Television, live coverage is next here on C-SPAN.
Welcome to Kentucky Tonight. Good evening. I'm Bill Goodman. Tonight we will discuss the U.S. Senate race. Our guests are Lexington Mayor Jim Gray of the Democratic Party and U.S. Senator Rand Paul of the Republican Party. We invite your questions tonight. Ask questions on Twitter at KYTonightKET. Send an email to kytonight@ket.org. Use the web form at ket.org/kytonight. Make sure you check the box that says you're not a robot. Or you may call us at 1-800-494-7605. Please include your first and last name, town or county on all messages. Gentlemen, thanks very much for being here on this KET Kentucky Tonight Candidate Forum. Senator Paul, give me the number one and most important issue facing the voters and citizens of Kentucky and what you would do about that issue in the United States Senate.
You know, I kind of jokingly will tell people sometimes that number one, number two, and number three is the debt. We have a $20 trillion debt. We borrow $1 million a minute, and I think it threatens our economy. I think it's like an anvil slowing us down. You know, we're staggering along with about a 1% growth now, and historically we've grown at 3%. For every percentage point of growth that's lost, it's about 1 million jobs. So really, we're about 2 million jobs short right now because of this burden of debt. I think it also threatens to undermine the country, really even the foundation of the country. Were interest rates to rise to 5, 6, or even I remember buying my first house at 11%, the debt would become unmanageable. And I just don't think it's a good idea to borrow for your daily activities. It's sort of like if you were giving advice to your kids, would you say, well, it's a good idea to borrow to pay your monthly rent or to pay for food? No, you would try to pay for that out of your income. You wouldn't borrow money to do that. But we're paying for our daily existence as a government. It's not just the $20 trillion debt. We also have a $7 trillion shortfall in Social Security that threatens Social Security as well. We have a $35 to $40 trillion deficit with Medicare. And some are still saying, oh, debt's not that big a deal, deficits don't matter. I think they really do. And it really, to be a sound country, to be a country that is great and growing, I think you have to have a balanced budget. And so what I've offered is we should actually have a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, because I think both parties have let us down. Republicans and Democrats have let us down with spending. And in fact, the compromise in Washington usually is to raise spending for both. So I think we should try to get it in order ourselves, but I think we also should probably mandate that we do it through a constitutional amendment as well.
Mayor Graham, I'm going to ask you about your number one issue, but I want you to comment first on the debt being Senator Paul's number one issue and what he would do about it.
Well, Bill, I'm glad you asked that. And it's perfect on Halloween night because Senator Paul is starting out with Halloween scare tactics. That's exactly what it is. It's more of his theories and philosophizing. He wants us to believe that his wild-ass theories and philosophies are the remedies for everything. And they're not. I know. I've been there. They will not build the first bridge. They will not build the first highway. They will not build the first factory. They will not create a job. I know because I've been there. And it's like Dizzy Dean said. What he said was, if you've done it, then you're not bragging. I've done it.
But the debt is of what concern to you? Do you think the debt is important to move America forward? You have been quoted as saying it's not a major issue.
No, what I said is that debt tied with equity is what makes a business run. And it's what also makes a country run. Today, investors are making investments in our country through our Treasury, through bonds. And they are being sold at some of the lowest rates ever in a decade. And that tells you that there is confidence in the U.S. economy. There's a lot of confidence in the U.S. economy. That's why the interest rates are so low. The deficit is 50% of what it was when Ronald Reagan was president. So of course we have to work on this. But my formula is to make investments in our country.
All right.
We have always made investments in our country, from World War II, the interstate highway system, after that the space program, which led to the inventiveness and the innovation of our country and the world ever since.
Senator Paul, response?
Well, you know, I think we can build things in our country. I think adding to the debt's not a great way to do it. I think that we ought to look at and make difficult decisions. And one of the things in Washington we need to do is say, if we're going to spend it on bridges, which I'm for, what should we take it away from instead of just adding to the debt? So we spent about $100 billion on infrastructure in Afghanistan. I would take a significant amount of that money and I would build roads and bridges here at home. So instead of building bridges in Afghanistan or Pakistan, let's build them at home. I would also look at foreign aid. We have about $30 billion in foreign aid. They say that about 70% of that is stolen right off the top. You remember the Mubarak family in Egypt? They're now worth $10, $15 billion. Much of that they simply stole from the taxpayer. So I would take, instead of giving money to foreign countries, I'd say let's spend that here at home. And then the third thing that I've offered for infrastructure is encouragement to American companies to bring their profit back home. There's about $2 trillion in unrepatriated or profit that was earned overseas that hasn't come home. In 2005, we lowered the rate to 5%, and a huge amount, and this was a bipartisan issue back then. President Obama voted for it. So we brought a huge amount of money back, about $300 billion. There's $2 trillion out there, and I have a bipartisan bill with Barbara Boxer that would lower the rate for 5 years, and we would take that money that comes home and put it into the highway fund. And I think this is a great example of how we could work together. Now, I called President Obama on this, and he was on Air Force One or so somewhere, but he took my phone call, and he said, well, I used to be for it, but I'm no longer for it. But that's a disappointing thing. If we can find Democrats who would actually work with us on saying, let's encourage that profit to come home, put it in the highway fund, I think that's a perfect solution for trying to fix the shortfall.
Mayor Gray, you have also talked about infrastructure, crumbling roads and bridges. How would you pay for it?
Well, Bill, we're $1 trillion short in infrastructure by 2020. And I have said that infrastructure is #1 on the priority list. And also advanced manufacturing, building infrastructure, building small businesses, and building the middle class. This is the only way that we grow ourselves. I've always said, when you're green, you grow, and when you're ripe, you rot. We cannot shrink ourselves to greatness.
And how would you pay for the infrastructure in the nation?
All right, let's start with making the investment that is going to be federal investment. Now, I disagree with Senator Paul because I believe the federal government can make these investments. Now, we can also give tax credits for what's called public-private partnerships. So we engage the private sector and we engage the public sector. But let's think back in history. After World War II, after the Great Depression, we always worked ourselves out of adversity. We built ourselves out of adversity, and the country wasn't afraid to make these investments.
Mayor Gray, what's your first and most important issue for the voters and citizens of Kentucky? And if elected as a United States Senator, how would you handle that issue?
Jobs, jobs, and jobs. We're not growing our economy at the rate it should. Now, just this month, it was announced that we grew at a 2.9% rate. So that's better, but we're not where we ought to be, where we can be, for the middle class to get a leg up in life. The middle class is the backbone of America. And we've got struggles across the state. We've got struggles in eastern Kentucky. We've got struggles in western Kentucky. We've got struggles in coal country. Now, I know a lot about this because I've spent my lifetime, a career in the private sector in growing a business that today employs thousands, has employed thousands over time, has grown through the factories that we have built. More than 20,000 people a day go through the doors of the plants built by Gray Construction. So I know about recruiting companies and plans. And that's exactly what I would do in eastern Kentucky and in western Kentucky. We've got to diversify the economy.
If you were asked to serve on a U.S. Senate Create Jobs Study Committee targeted for and about Kentucky jobs, just give me one recommendation that you would make to put people to work in eastern and western Kentucky.
I would work to put another Toyota plant in eastern Kentucky and one in western Kentucky. I was there before Toyota came to Kentucky. I was in Japan. I quit counting after I'd been to Japan more than 35 times. That's just an example. There are plenty of opportunities for us, but we've got to work on it. We've got to focus on it. Focus on Kentucky rather than focus on running for president. Now, the senator has focused on running for president for the last 5 years and not focused on Kentucky and the challenges that we have right here in Kentucky.
Senator Paul, comment on that, as well as on a jobs program that if you were on this same work-study committee in the U.S. Senate, targeted for and about Kentucky, what would you do?
You know, I think the biggest impediment we have to growing as an economy, we have the debt burden, but we also have a regulatory burden and a tax burden. So when you travel throughout eastern Kentucky, they understand why they've lost their jobs. It's because of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Barack Obama said he would bankrupt. Hillary Clinton has said, you know what, she's going to continue to put coal miners out of business. The mayor's endorsed both of these candidates, so it makes it very difficult for him in western Kentucky or eastern Kentucky to convince people that he's for them when he's for these regulations that have been killing their jobs. So you have to repeal the regulatory war on coal, on the family farm. We've talked about farm regulations. He's for the new farm regulations, waters of the U.S. We can't keep federalizing everything, but there's also a tax burden. We have the highest corporate income tax in the world, 35%. If we want to thrive and keep our companies from reincorporating and taking those jobs overseas, I would lower that. I have a plan to lower it below 15%. But I would vote for any kind of bipartisan movement to lower the corporate income tax. And so to compete, you got to compete on the things that are a cost of doing business. Taxes are a big cost, regulations are a big cost, and to the entire economy, the debt is a big cost.
All right, last comment on jobs, Mayor Gray.
Well, I think I want to comment on what Senator Paul said about bipartisan, because he says that a bunch of times, but the Lugar Center just recently named him the 6th most partisan senator out of the last 20 years, the 6th most partisan senator. Now, it's really hard to get people to go along with you when you're an obstructionist. It's really hard to get people to focus on what's essential, which is, yes, creating jobs. I've done it all my life. I've demonstrated it. Performance and experience is what counts.
Senator?
Well, I'd like to correct the record a little bit on that. If you look at my record, you'll actually find some extraordinary partnerships that I've had with people across the aisle. I've worked with Ron Wyden extensively on privacy issues. We have half a dozen bills we've worked together on. We're working on a letter to the president right now. I've worked with Cory Booker on criminal justice reform. I've worked with Barbara Boxer on trying to repatriate profit here. I just finished working with Ed Markey, who's a progressive Democrat from Massachusetts, on trying to help the drug problem, trying to allow doctors to see more people, to step them down and get them off of heroin. So I think what you'll see is I've worked with Harry Reid on voter restoration. So, I mean, you really will see that when I believe in something, I don't let parties stand in the way of it at all, that I've actually got a strong record of actually working with people on the other side.
Senator Paul, Mayor Gray claims your efforts to dismantle the nation's intelligence is dangerous, his word. The commercial he's running against you on national security and defense quotes Donald Trump saying Rand Paul is a disaster on military and defense. He quotes John McCain as saying you simply do not have the understanding of the threats of the United States national security. And even New Jersey Republican Governor Chris Christie said what Rand Paul has done to make this country weaker is a terrible thing. Right. How do you respond to the ad and to these accusations?
You know, I think one of the most important rights that our founding fathers put into the Bill of Rights was the Fourth Amendment, and it is really the right to be left alone. Justice Brandeis said in the Olmstead case back in 1928, he said, the most cherished right among civilized men and women is the right to be left alone. Our founding fathers were very worried about the government coming in without a warrant. So one of the checks and balances, they said, is police can't come in your house. They have to call an independent person who's supposed to be dispassionate, removed from the scene. This is the same with looking at your phone records. So let's say the example of the Boston bombers. I think we should have done more to look at their records. The FBI was tipped off, I think did an inadequate job, and didn't do a deep enough dive on their records. But at the same time, I don't want to look at everybody in Boston's records or everybody in Lexington's records. I think you do have a right to privacy in your records unless there's probable cause, unless we individualize the search warrant. And the great thing about search warrants and separating that power, the police power, is that it prevents police who might be bigoted in any way on race, color, creed, gender, you name it. It prevents some of that bigotry from happening if you have checks and balances in the system. But if you simply say, oh my goodness, we must do anything, I'm willing to trade my liberty for security, That's a real problem. I mean, Franklin recognized this even from the very beginning. He says, if you trade your liberty for security, you may wind up with neither. So, no, I think you can have security and continue to defend the Constitution. And we take an oath. I mean, I take it very seriously. I took an oath to defend the Constitution. And I treat that as a very serious promise.
Mayor Gray, you said in one of your commercials, you will do what it takes to defeat terrorists. What is it that you will do?
Well, one thing you don't do is what Senator Paul did in his first budget proposal, which was to cut defense spending by $150 million, or 30%. Now, you notice he did not respond to your question about what these other colleagues of his within his own party had said about his record. Because he knows they are accurate. He recommended reducing the military budget by $150 million. Now, when he started running for president, he changed. 3 years later, he changed, and he decided to then add to the military budget. Terrorism is a threat, and it takes money and it takes funds to fight these threats at home and abroad. And when we pull foreign aid, which he has suggested, from our allies, that also compromises our defense. It compromises our ability to defend our country abroad and then at home. We will not have economic security and opportunity if we don't have a safe America.
So to defeat terrorism, you would?
I would encourage our intelligence community. I would encourage our defense investment, our investment in defense. Now that means smart, intelligent investments. I've learned from Toyota. The Toyota production system teaches you continuous improvement, and this is what we should apply to every spending in government.
Under what circumstances should the U.S. Send troops into the Middle East conflicts, and there are many of them today?
There are hotbeds, there are tinderboxes everywhere, Bill, and we've got to be careful. But sending advisors, committing ourselves to advisors like we have in Iraq, going into Mosul today, that's a prudent and a wise investment that America must make in order for us to be safe at home.
Well, I think the biggest thing that separates us on national security is that, he's endorsed Hillary Clinton and her foreign policy and her national security ideas, but, I think she's a danger to the country. I think Hillary Clinton's lack of defense in Benghazi is inexcusable, shows terrible judgment, and means really she should never be commander-in-chief. So the philosophy of Hillary Clinton and my opponent, I think, is a really bad mistake, because she, for 6 months, kept pulling the security out, even though Colonel Wood and the security team said we want to stay. The ambassador was pleading for help, and I asked her this directly in the committee, why did you do this? Did you read the cables begging for help? And she kind of just acted put off that she didn't have time to read all the cables from the ambassadors. With regard to cuts in the military, I think once again there's a misrepresentation of the record. I put together 3 different budgets since I've been in office, because when I ran for office I said, what makes me mad about Republicans and Democrats is they talk about balancing the budget, but no one ever puts a pencil to paper and says, this is how you'd balance a budget. So I did. And the interesting thing I found is that you don't have to cut military spending. And if you look at each of my budgets over a 5-year period, military spending grows. What happens to people who are caught up in sort of the liberal Hillary Clinton world is they say, oh, well, Hillary Clinton wanted to add $1 trillion, and you're only going to add $500 billion, so you cut it $500 billion, when in reality they're talking about cuts in proposed increases. But if you look at my budget, you'll actually find that I give priority to the military. In fact, in the budgets after the sequester, I actually added more military spending than the sequester allowed, tried to give the Pentagon the freedom to allow the money to be moved around in the Pentagon so it could be more effectively spent. But to my mind, there is no more important expenditure than national security. There is no greater priority than national security. It's one of the few things under the Constitution we must do. But the difference is we just shouldn't pile on debt.
So the claim that you did cut defense spending by 30% is false?
False. It's a cut in a proposed increase that somebody else proposed, not me. If you look at the absolute numbers for all of my budgets over a 5-year period, military spending grew in all of the budgets that I proposed.
All right, Mayor Gray, last comment on this.
Well, he's saying he was against it before he was for it. He was against investments in the military before he was for it. Even his colleagues in the Senate have said that he would do more to destroy and compromise America's intelligence network than anyone. Now, there's something else that should be noted here, and it's important to do it now. Senator Paul has already mentioned Hillary Clinton 3 times. Now that tells you that he's still obsessed about the presidential campaign. He's still thinking about the presidential campaign. He's not thinking about Kentuckians and Kentuckians' needs and challenges and problems. That's what I'm committed to, serving Kentucky. He's not even agreed that he will serve a full term. I made a pledge I would serve a full term, and I'll ask him now, Senator, will you serve a full term in the U.S. Senate if you're elected?
You know, the funny thing about hypocrisy is people come up with these things and it's like, well, Mayor, you're going to serve a full term as mayor. You're the only one running for 2 offices. In fact, if anybody up here is distracted by running for 2 offices, it's you. I mean, you got an enormous hole in the middle of Lexington. It's been there your entire tenure. You've been there 8 years, and you're talking about something that doesn't exist. And here you are running for 2 offices. Why don't you take a pledge to do your job as mayor? I mean, you got a lot of stuff to do. I mean, you could keep busy for another 8 years working on the hole in downtown.
Well, you did run for president and for the Senate. You made a law. You created a law that was going to allow you to move for the Senate and for the president at the same time.
But a hypocrite would be somebody. A hypocrite would be somebody who criticizes someone while doing the exact same thing.
I actually performed in my job.
Yeah.
I actually have performed in my job. You talk about budgets. I met a budget. I had a deficit. I made 6 years of surpluses out of it. I had a pension reform, a $300 million underfunded pension. I fixed it. I had health insurance, $40 million when we were costing $40 million and we were budgeting $20 million. We were losing $20 million. I fixed it. You have had 134 bills and none of them have passed.
Actually, I've had 490 bills. I'm proud of that. I've introduced more legislation than just about anybody. Shows that I am an active senator. I've had 40 votes on the floor, more than any senator from my class of 2010. And we've been very active. I can tell you in the last 6 months, 3 things that we got passed. We got the expanded doctor role in treating the heroin epidemic passed. We were able to stop, a $1 million tax on all the cities around Lake Cumberland. And we were also get the Census Bureau to actually start counting our soldiers when they're overseas in the census count for Hopkinsville and other cities. So also made 96% of my votes. Many people ran for president and missed half their votes. I made 96% of my votes. So I think, some have said I'm the hardest working senator up there, and I think it's probably true.
You're watching Kentucky Tonight on KET on this Monday evening with our U.S. Senate candidates. This tweet tonight from Joe Farley in Callaway County. He asks both of you, what are your stances on the growing student debt crisis, and how do you plan to fix it? Mayor Gray.
Well, I think it's a shame. I think it's a terrible shame, and I think we ought to work on it. There are more than 40 million people in our country today who have student debts, an average of about $30,000 per person, and that's a shame. And at minimum, those with these loans should be able to refinance them at a minimum. An education is the framework for the rest of your life. It provides a framework. Now, I have run into young people across the state. One woman in Louisville, not that long ago, just a month ago, who said she had gotten a master's degree, recently gotten a master's degree, still hasn't gotten a job though. And she has a 6-figure debt. And younger people in other locations across the state.
Is there a role for the federal government in the debt crisis that face so many students?
Well, I think this is the sort of thing, Bill, that we need to get our arms around, and we need to recognize that we've got to work on problems like this and get through this gridlock and get through the dysfunction that is represented so much in Washington, that despite what Senator Paul has just described as the reaching out across the aisle, that's not his history. And it is my history. I've worked with Republicans and Democrats to get problems solved in Lexington.
Senator Paul, on the debt crisis, is there a role? What could or should the federal government do to get involved in usually a state program like tuition to go to a state university or a private school?
One of the things that we have done in reaching across the aisle is to come up with a bill to allow students to deduct not only the principal but the interest. Sometimes we allow students to deduct the interest, but many people are excluded because of their parents' income. Many people are excluded because their income, they can only do it over a certain period of time. So we would expand the eligibility for those who can deduct the principal and the interest on their student loans. I look at a student loan as sort of being a work expense, and I think you ought to be able to deduct it during your whole work career. So we would expand the ability to deduct it not just for a couple years, but really for your entire career. The problem is if you have a $50,000 student debt, but you make $35,000 a year, you often don't have the income to be able to deduct the $50,000 in a year or two. You may need 10 years, you may need 20 years to deduct it. My bill would do that. The other side of the equation, though, everybody talks about trying to help students pay for it. We also ought to look at the price, and prices come down when there's competition. President Obama, who my opponent has endorsed, he has had a war on private colleges. We have many private colleges here in Kentucky, and they tell me every day that President Obama's war on them is difficult. They're suing them every day. They're putting new roadblocks. They put roadblocks in the way of private schools that they don't put in the way of private schools. So we're closing them down. President Obama even closed down the accreditation agency the other day. And then really, here's the kicker. Some of President Obama's retired and bought one of the universities after they drove the price down to almost nothing. Then they bought it, so they're actually making money off of their war on private colleges. So no, we have a lot of good private colleges in Kentucky. That's part of the answer, is having more colleges to drive prices down.
This question from Steve Everett in Todd County. He asks, we had a response from you on both of those, on student debt.
Yes.
We did,
Yeah.
Mayor Gray and Senator Paul. Steve Everett, Todd County, for the incumbent, what haven't you accomplished in the past 6 years that you would like to accomplish if reelected? And for you, Mayor Gray, what could you accomplish in your first term that the incumbent failed to achieve in his first term? Senator Paul.
You know, the oath of office we take is to defend the Constitution, defend the country, protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, you know, foreign and domestic. Debt is an enemy of the country, and we need to keep working on that. There are bipartisan faults in Republicans and Democrats still wanting to spend too much money. Another responsibility we were given under the Constitution is to only go to war when there's a declaration of war by Congress. Hillary Clinton, whom my opponent has, endorsed, she took us to war in Libya. I call it Hillary's war in Libya because she did it on her own. She advocated toppling Assad, which I think he does also. But they want to do it just willy-nilly with unilateral presidential authority, and that's not a good way to go to war, and it also leads to things that have untoward consequences. So, for example, in wanting to eliminate Gaddafi in Libya, we now have ISIS controlling a third of the territory. In pushing back Assad, ISIS was allowed to expand in that vacuum. Now, Hillary Clinton spent $250 million training 60 fighters, $4 million a fighter or more. They sent 10 of them to war. And I've sort of tragically said to people, what kind of president sends 10 people to war? They were captured in 15 minutes. That doesn't happen if a country votes and becomes unified, Republican and Democrat, to fight a war. We have done that. After 9/11, we were unified as a country. After Pearl Harbor, we were unified as a country. But I think that one thing we need to do better, and I will continue to force votes on, is whether we should continue sending arms to countries that are allowing those arms to go to ISIS. Hillary Clinton was aware, according to the Podesta emails, she was aware that arms were going from Saudi Arabia, from the U.S. to Saudi Arabia to ISIS, and she did nothing about it. That's one more thing why we should never, ever let her get within 10 miles of the White House.
Mayor Gray, what could you accomplish in your first term that the incumbent failed to achieve in his first term?
Well, Senator Paul talks a lot about balancing the budget, and he never got it done. He never came close to it, really, even though it's today at a 50% level of what it was when Ronald Reagan was president. I've actually balanced the budget, had to, for 6 years, and created 5 years of surpluses. Now, I would work on doing it and getting it done. I would, at the very beginning, sponsor national legislation for infrastructure. It's essential that we put our infrastructure at the top of the list. By 2020, we will be $1 trillion behind. And the National Society of Civil Engineers has given us a D+ ranking. So that's got to be done. And what it will do is it will stimulate the economy in every dimension. That's been proven over and over.
A couple of follow-ups on that one first, and then we'll go back to the declaration of war. Again, infrastructure crumbling, how would you pay for it? Is there a plan that you would use?
I've said that we would work with the private sector, public-private partnerships, and we would provide tax credits where appropriate to private companies who are investing in infrastructure. But the federal government must also make an investment. This notion that you can shrink yourself to greatness does not work.
Would it come through any taxation?
And you've got to look at, that would be the last thing that you would look at, but it is essential that we get our arms around this problem and work together to find these solutions, and that's not happening. And Senator Paul has been a part of that problem.
And on a declaration of war that he is asking for in many of the areas in conflict.
I would actually agree with Senator Paul that the Congress has that authority, and it is appropriate that the Congress engage that authority.
All right, let me move on to another issue that you're all too familiar with. Unfortunately, the scourge of the opioid epidemic that has spread across the nation and is well entrenched in Kentucky. It's a complicated issue with many facets, measures of surviving opioid use that unfortunately, again, is available to only a few. Gentlemen, give me one specific program you have seen that has worked in the state of Kentucky, and give me one that you think we would need to do that might require more funding in fighting the opioid disease. One program that you've seen that has worked, and one that you would like to institute that would more than likely require more funding. Senator Paul?
We've visited a lot of the different places trying to help people overcome addiction. Isaiah House, Healing Place, Teen Challenge. At Teen Challenge, one of the things I liked was that they combine abstinence with work and also with faith. And I think that you got to fix the whole person. I mean, people are addicted to drugs because I think a broken spirit, and I think that a religious element, a faith-based element to the cure is imperative. But I think also work is important. Many people have never worked, they're idle and they're at home, and part of the cure is as we get them off drugs, showing them what it's like to work and learning that, you know, get up in the morning, show up for work, and stay all day and do a good job. And I think both of those are good. One of the things that I got included in the opioid bill that I felt strongly about was the federal government was limiting how many patients could get the replacement treatment that comes with detoxification as you try to get somebody off. Some can stop cold turkey, but others have to sort of do a stepwise program to get off of heroin. And it is devastating. I mean, we have more people dying from heroin than car accidents now in Kentucky, so it's a devastating problem. But I was pleased that I was able to work with a Democrat, Ed Markey from Massachusetts, and get that included in the bill. President Obama actually agreed with me, and you know, I don't often agree with President Obama. When I do, I'm happy to say so. But in that case, we had a bipartisan coalition that passed this, Republicans and Democrats, and the president ended up signing the bill.
Mayor Gray, two programs, one that you've seen that works and one that you think you would like to institute that might require more funding.
Well, I see this firsthand as a mayor. And in Kentucky, 1,200 deaths from heroin and opioid abuse overdoses just last year. In our city, 3 years ago, we saw this coming in 2013, and I created a heroin task force to work and to bring all of our agencies together to try to address and to work to address this issue in a meaningful way. Our first responders were given the Narcan and naloxone in order to administer, and that's been helpful. But what we need is more support from the federal government. Now, fortunately, the CARA Act, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, was passed by the Congress, and Senator Paul voted for it. But he voted against funding, which would help us in the cities across the country, in our states across the country. Now, I'd like for him to explain why he voted against it, why he voted for the bill and then against the funding. We need these funds. This is a scourge. This is an epidemic. As he said, more are dying of heroin and opioid deaths, overdoses, than are being lost on traffic deaths across the country. So he should explain that.
You know, I voted for CARA, which was the opioid bill, and am happy to vote for the appropriation for it. What happened, though, is what's been happening to government for the last 19 years. All the funding was stuck together in one enormous bill, 2,000 pages. No one read the bill. No one has any idea what's in it. And there were no reforms made. So the bill that was passed, 2,000 pages, continues to borrow $1 million a minute. There are no reforms. It's a really terrible, rotten, no good way to run your government. It's why the deficit's so bad. What we need to do is actually pass individual appropriation bills, and then Kara would have been in an individual appropriation bill, which I would have supported. But I can't support just more of the same, because I ran for office honestly telling people that the debt is a really problem. I disagree fundamentally on this. I think the debt is a problem, and we have to do something about it. And it's going to take people with courage to stand up, even against demagoguery, people that will demagogue the issue and say you're opposed to something you're actually for, because we have to fix the spending problem. And we can't just continue to vote for bills that allow us to, we're approaching $20 trillion. If you come into my office in Washington, we're very upfront about this. We have a debt clock. It is spinning literally out of control. And when people say deficits don't matter, boy, we don't need people like that in office, because the deficits do matter. They really are a big problem. They're this anvil that's slowing the economy down.
He goes on with these philosophies and theories. And he's continuing on it. The debt as a percentage of the GDP is at one of its lowest levels, 1.2% today. That's the interest on the debt today, $209 billion. Yeah, those are big numbers. It's a big economy. It's clear he's never run a business, because if he'd run a business, I grew from a small family business into a business today doing more than $1 billion a year in revenue. And you don't do that by being casual. You don't do that by not understanding debt and not understanding equity and not understanding return on investment. We're talking about return on investment for our country and making investments that will give us the opportunity and the next generation the opportunity to actually have a better life and a leg up in life. And that's what he doesn't get.
Do you accept his explanation on why he didn't vote for the...
No, I don't accept it, because it's obtuse, it's arcane, it's nonsense. Because he says he's for it, and then he votes against it because he says there's 2,000 pages to it.
Gentlemen, there are two questions here, one question for each of you on the presidential candidates. George Hanrahan in Frankfurt asked Senator Paul, are you supporting Donald Trump for president? And James Bratcher in Louisville asked, does Mr. Gray still support Hillary Clinton after the latest news about her emails? Mr. Mayor Gray.
You know, I have been a Democrat all my life, and the reason I'm a Democrat is because Democrats are for the working man and woman. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to support and endorse every idea of a Democrat. I've said that every Democratic idea is not a good one, every Republican idea is not a bad one.
What is a good Republican idea?
I support the nominee of our party. I am the Democratic nominee for the Senate, and I support the nominee of our party.
Can you give me one good Republican idea? Because you've used this over the course of the campaign several times.
Actually, Andy Barr had a really great idea, and that was the bourbon bill that he created a couple of years ago.
All right, Senator Paul.
And I believe Senator Paul voted against it.
Senator Paul, supporting Donald Trump for president?
Yes. And the reason is that I think it'd be better for Kentucky. You know, when you compare them, Hillary Clinton was quite, explicit in saying that her policies, and I presume the mayor will continue to support these policies of the power plant regulations, the stream guidance rule, the cross-state pollution rules, all of these regulations that have come to us from Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, who he supports, have killed our jobs. We've lost 15,000 jobs in eastern Kentucky. When you travel out there, some of the counties, a third of the people are not working. They're not counted in unemployment, but a third of the people are not working out there. And it's sad. And it's because of this regulatory war on coal. And Donald Trump said he would repeal the war on coal. On taxes, they want to increase taxes. Donald Trump says he wants to lower taxes. If you look at the wars that have been fought overseas, Donald Trump says that we should declare war. He doesn't agree with Hillary Clinton. He doesn't agree with the Iraq war. So I think you find that on every front, the war on farmers, the regulatory war that they champion, where they want to federalize all land use and where every farm in Kentucky would be controlled by the federal government. Trump's against that. Hillary Clinton's for it. So I think really if you endorse Hillary Clinton, you disqualify yourself. I don't know how you could represent Kentucky, because everything she stands for is against what we need in Kentucky. All of the jobs, you want to be for jobs? How can you be for jobs when she's for job-destroying regulations? I don't understand. They don't seem to make sense, how you can endorse Hillary Clinton and still pretend to be in favor of Kentucky jobs.
Well, let me tell you, I'm like Donald Trump on this. Give somebody else a chance. He's had 6 years to try to fix things, and he's done nothing. He has not created the first new job for people in coal country. Now, he's also created a war on coal miners. He is against the Coal Miners Protection Act, which would give coal miners, which would give them and fulfill the promise made to them in 1947, retired coal miners It would give them their pension, provide their pension benefits and their health benefits. I know a man named Frankie Clayton from Webster County. Frankie is 70 years old, a retired coal miner, and just last week he got a notice in the mail. He got a notice that he was going to lose his health insurance at the end of December. Now, this is a bill in Congress today that can't get out of the Finance Committee of the Senate. And Senator Paul has said he's against it because it's not perfect. He's always letting perfect get in the way of good. This is a big problem. It's a big problem for our country when you have this kind of spirit and this kind of attitude that perfect is going to get in the way of good.
Why have you come out against that bill, Senator Paul?
I'm actually for the concept. I am for the concept of taking, there's excess money in the reclamation fund. There's about $2 billion. I'm actually for using that to help with the coal miners' pension. However, you have to look at why is the pension failing, and will that fix the ultimate problem, or will we be back here a year later trying to patch up this problem? The pensions are bankrupt because Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's war on coal that my opponent supports. And so the thing is that if you're not going to end the regulatory war on coal, how will you ever shore up the pensions? The companies have to survive. See, if you had 10,000 workers paying pension and you have 10,000 retirees, you might be able to take care of them. But what if you go from 10,000 workers to 1,000 workers or 0 workers? Why did that happen? Because of the war on coal. So what I've advocated for, and I think there is the leverage to do this, I'm all for the bill. But what I want to attach to it is regulatory relief, and that's what being a legislator is about, trying to make a bill such it would actually fix the problem and not just be window dressing. So I actually want to fix the problem, and that is coal companies have to be able to make more money, they have to succeed, and there has to be more workers employed by them paying into the pension for it to succeed. And the only way you can do that is you have to end the regulatory war on coal. But we have to convince Democrats of this because we have one Democrat that will vote with us on any of the regulatory reform. There are no other Democrats in Washington that will vote for any regulatory reform, and that's really our problem.
Senator Paul has declared coal dead. He's also said that coal is a dirty form of energy. I believe coal is a part of our energy future. And I believe that we should support the miners in this act. He's against it. He said he's against it. Now, he's colored it in lots of different ways, that it's part of the Mine Reclamation Fund and it's not sufficient for everybody. But he's not going to support it for those whose the promises have been made to. And everybody in coal country should know this and should recognize this.
You're watching Kentucky Tonight on KET. Our U.S. Senate candidate, Senator Rand Paul, and Mayor Jim Gray are in the studio for questions. And this question, a tweet from Carolyn Halcomb in Lancaster to you, Senator Paul. Will you allow the Supreme Court nominee to proceed under a Hillary Clinton presidency? That would be Garrick Merritt, who was nominated and has not been acted on.
We're having a great constitutional debate. I mean, a profound constitutional debate in our country. And it is over whether or not the president can act unilaterally to write law. Montesquieu was one of the philosophers that our founding fathers looked to, and he said that when the executive begins to legislate, a form of tyranny will ensue. That's what's happening now. I mean, we have a president who thinks he's king, and he thinks he can write the law. He did this in immigration. He changed the law for 4 to 5 million people without the authority or assent of Congress. And the court finally just said recently that he went too far. On the power plant or utility regulations that are killing the coal industry, he also wrote that without our permission. We never voted on it in Congress. The arbiter of whether or not he's acting constitutionally will be the Supreme Court. And so it is going to be very difficult for me to vote for a candidate who's coming forward saying that they want to abuse the Constitution, abuse the people to allow power to gravitate to the presidency that's unconstitutional. So I can't imagine voting for a Clinton nominee unless you were to appoint somebody that actually were someone who believed in the separation of powers as the founders wrote into the Constitution.
Mayor Gray?
Well, I'm very practical about things, Bill. Senator Paul quotes French philosophers instead of answering the question. The question was real clear. Would he vote for the nominee? Would he take up the nomination? The Constitution was pretty clear on this, that the president makes the nomination and the Senate then takes up that nomination through an advice and consent process. Real clear on it. I think the Senate should have done its job, and I don't know why it didn't do its job. And I think most people in America really don't understand that, except it's another illustration of the gridlock and the dysfunction in our system. As us, it's very practical. It looks very practical to most people, and it does to me.
Senator Paul, if Hillary Clinton is successful next Tuesday, would you support any nominee during her term in office that she would bring before the Senate?
I'll support any nominee that pledges to uphold the separation of powers doctrine of the Constitution. And so that's a question I'll have. I will interview all of them. I will have them come to my office for private discussions. But they have to believe in the Constitution. I mean, my oath is to defend the Constitution. If she should appoint somebody who believes in the separation of powers, that the president doesn't get to write the laws, I will consider them. But that's really the problem. And we have this fundamental philosophical difference in our country between one party who believes in excess power gravitating to the presidency and that the president can do anything, and those of us who believe in the constitutional restraints that allow for, some people can call it gridlock, but basically checks and balances are debate, and they are trying to get unanimity or trying to get consensus to move things forward instead of just saying, oh, we can't, President Obama said this. He said, oh, I can't, Congress won't do what I want, so I've got my pen, I've got my phone, I'll do what I want. That is, the words of an autocrat, not the words of somebody that we should be aspiring to return to office.
Gentlemen, the murder rate in Kentucky's two largest cities has increased over this past year. What measures do you support that would make it more difficult for dangerous people to get guns in Kentucky, Mayor Gray?
Well, Bill, I have said that I would support the terrorism loophole legislation that Senator Paul opposed, and that would provide that terrorists and criminals and those who are severely mentally ill would not have access to guns. And I think that is, at a minimum, what should be done. Yes, I see this really up close. I see this issue up close. I talk to mothers and fathers who have lost their children. And so as a mayor, you don't ever escape it. I would support that legislation. I would support universal background checks. Now, I grew up in a culture, like most of us in Kentucky, a hunting culture, where guns and hunting was a part of everyday life. So I respect and I endorse the Second Amendment. And I believe that we should put our arms around this challenge and this problem because it is way, way more than something that we should ignore. And that's what has been done in Congress for far too long.
Senator?
I don't think we should ignore the immigration law. And there are certain cities and rumors of certain cities that just basically ignore the immigration law. I voted for Kate's law, which says that any city that chooses not to enforce the immigration law should be removed from their federal funding. And I think that's a pretty important thing, and I don't think we've gotten much support from across the aisle on this because it was pretty sad, what happened to Kate. She was a beautiful young woman out in San Francisco who was killed by an illegal immigrant that had been, deported 5 times. So we have to do a better job. But once again, that was President Obama then looking at immigration law and saying, we don't really care who comes, when they come. We're going to open the doors wide open and have open borders. That was coming from President Obama without any congressional input. So when we try to pass Kate's law to say that cities like San Francisco, you can't ignore the law and you have to transfer people to other custody. You can't just release hardened criminals into life. So I think that would go a long way towards trying to make our cities safer.
Mayor Gray mentioned the closing the gun show loophole. Your comments on that?
We have background checks, and I support, background checks. If you look at where the crime is coming from, the vast majority of crime is coming from guns that are bought illegally. And so we have to look into that. We have to police our cities. I think we also have to think about whether violent criminals should be being released so easily. One of the things I've favored with nonviolent crime is trying to get some of the nonviolent criminals out of prison so we have more space for the violent criminals to stay longer. When they did this in California, they actually were able to find that by releasing some of the nonviolent people, they had much more room for violent criminals. And before they were getting early release, but we were able to keep them in prison longer. But I think we have to look at, what we're doing with violent criminals and keeping them separate from the public.
This phone call question from Alan Steinberg in Louisville. How does each candidate feel about raising the minimum wage? Mayor Gray?
Well, I'm for it. In Lexington, we actually passed an increase in the minimum wage. And I think it represents the backbone of our economy in so many respects. It represents more than 80 years of history. And regrettably, the Congress, this is another example where the Congress, through gridlock and its dysfunction, has failed to act. And it meant then that a city like Lexington, a city like Louisville, had to act and had to do its job, had to do the job that the Congress should have been doing. Now, my understanding is Senator Paul is not only against an increase in the minimum wage, Senator Paul is against the minimum wage itself. I think that's wrong. I think it denies, and it is a denial of so much of the history of our country, a progressive movement of more than 100 years ago that recognized that a minimum wage was essential in a functioning capitalist environment and society.
Senator?
The Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, looks at these issues and tries to figure out what would be the consequences of things. If you raise the wage, a government set wage, above the market would set, what you get is unemployment. The greater the differential between the market wage and the government wage, the greater the unemployment. They predicted if the minimum wage were raised at $10 an hour, that 500,000 people would lose their job. There are probably 98 studies I saw about a year ago. I think that's how many we found. Every one of them showing that it leads to unemployment. It's particularly bad in the sense that it leads to unemployment among many of the people with the least skills or the least chances, where there's so many obstacles. So actually, black teenagers have suffered more from raising the minimum wage above the market wage than almost any other category. What I would really like is to see wages way above the minimum wage. And I've traveled Kentucky. This is one of the things that really has impressed me. In the last 6 months, I've done about 130 town halls. I've been to industry after industry. And the main thing they're telling me, it isn't that they're paying $6 an hour, they're paying $12 an hour. I think I've been in 20 different industries paying $12 an hour. They said they're having trouble getting people to work for that. Their main problem, they say, are we need people with work ethic and people who are drug-free. So there are complicated problems that we have in our country, but if you raise the wage above the market wage, the people who are trying to get started in life, are hurt by this. I have 3 boys. They've all worked minimum wage. They've all learned what it's like to deliver pizzas and work as a host in a restaurant or a call center. And frankly, that's how I grew up working.
Listen,
hard
I'm a
work with
businessman.
very small amounts, and I think it's good for the country to actually let people have access to work and learn the work ethic at a young age.
I got to respond to that. I'm a businessman, and I've worked through the minimum wage myself. Nobody in our company today makes a minimum wage, but I can tell you that a lot of people do make the minimum wage, and he's dead wrong on this. He's dead wrong on it. It's just like he's dead wrong on pay equity for women. Most of the people who earn minimum wage today are women. That's who's struggling, and that's who's suffering. And either he's missing it or he's denying it.
Senator, response?
Well, all of the economists disagree. They all say that raising the wage above the market wage leads to unemployment. Congressional Budget Office says 500,000 jobs will be lost. I mean, a good way to look at this is, let's say minimum wage is $7.25 and you make it $15. If you double it, if a McDonald's has 20 employees, what do you think happens? Do you think they hire more people at 15 or less? We already saw it with Obamacare. They loved Obamacare, and they said, we're going to help poor people with Obamacare. The rates are going through the roof, but also what happened is they said if you work 30 hours, you have to get Obamacare, which was a cost of doing business. And so if you work 32 hours, guess what? A lot of people got moved back to 28 hours. Congressional Budget Office on this said Obamacare. Their big beauty. They love Obamacare. They want the government involved in everything. It said 2.2 million people lost jobs because of it.
So he's also going to take health care away from 20 million Americans and 400,000 Kentuckians.
Gentlemen, let's move on to another issue as we wrap up on our program tonight. According to the most recent Kids Count report, for the first time ever, more than 1 in 4 kids in Kentucky live in poverty. How will you give me one recommendation on the way you would tackle that if you are either returned or go to the U.S. Senate, and how that program would work? Mayor Gray, let me begin with you.
Well, I think we have to start with education. And the investment that we make in education is essential. And this is why jobs are so critical and so important. Growing our economy at a level where everyone has a chance allows us to grow out of then the poverty conditions that are plaguing us. We've got to have jobs. This is why I've said it's number one. Jobs in jobs as a senator, and some will say, you know, that a Senate is not a place, a U.S. Senator doesn't have anything to do with jobs. I think that's dead wrong. It's like saying that a U.S. Senator doesn't have anything to do with education or poverty. We have to look and examine all of these issues, and we have to examine them carefully, thoughtfully, every day, get our arms around them.
Senator?
You know, it's under President Obama, who my opponent supported and endorsed, it's under Hillary Clinton, 30 years of Hillary Clinton, that these policies have been enacted that are leading to this anemic growth. So we have to ask, how do we grow faster? You know, we're growing at about 1% right now. Historically, we've grown at least 3%. When Ronald Reagan was president, he lowered taxes dramatically. I mean, he had 1 year of 7% growth. So we can grow at a much more rapid pace, but we have to have a debate. I mean, that's what this is about. It's a forum, but it's a debate. It's about what policies are better. Raising taxes, raising regulations, debt doesn't matter, or that maybe we should run our government your own family, that you have to balance your budget. You can't have too much debt. Taxes should be low, and the regulatory burden needs to be lowered and removed, because what's happening is their policies are killing our economy.
30 seconds to each on this final question. A email question from Tyler Yandel of Davis County. What has been your biggest regret during your political career?
You know, probably the time I've had to spend away from my kids and my family. And we try very hard as a family to stay together and do as much, but I spent a lot of hours in airports and traveling. And you know, time away probably is the most difficult thing. But, you know, I've been married for 26 years, and we have a family life that we try to keep our kids involved in church and sports and athletics.
30 seconds to Mayor Gray.
We have a lot of ambitious goals. In my time as mayor, we've had a lot of aspirational goals, and we've achieved a lot of those, and that's because we focused on getting our financial house in order and getting things done in every dimension of our city, and I'm very proud of that. But sometimes I'm called a perfectionist, and I want to get it all done.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for being here on Kentucky Tonight. Tune in Friday night at 8, 7 Central for Comment on Kentucky with Bill Bryant. And again next Monday for Kentucky Tonight, when we'll discuss the election. Thanks for watching. For KET, I'm Bill Goodman. Good evening.
There's more debate coverage to look forward to this week. On Wednesday,